Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Torah with Cypora podcast. I am Cypora. I am so excited for today's episode because I have a guest. Our guest today is a world-renowned speaker and educator. She taught for many years in Neve Yerushalayim alongside Torah intellectuals like Rebbetzin Cypora Gottlieb and Rabbi David Refson. She has since moved back to the States, where for many years she has been teaching in Mesoras Beis Yaakov High School, the New Seminary, Benos Yaakov, Chachmas Nashim, and the Jewish Renaissance Center, along with giving a weekly shir to two groups of women, including the quote-unquote Monday shir that I referenced in the first episode. She's one of the most knowledgeable and intelligent people I know, as well as one of the most kind and most genuine. I knew as soon as I decided to start this podcast that she absolutely had to be my first guest. And lucky enough for us, she agreed to come on. I am so excited to welcome Mrs. Ivy, Mrs. Chaya Kalazan. Welcome to the Torah with Cypora podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Cypora. I have to tell you, I'm really excited to be on this because, first of all, when you just see what a student of yours can really produce in terms of learning and exciting and getting people stimulated in thought, it's something that we always saw back then from when you were in the classroom, that you always got everybody thinking and involved, and it's amazing how you're sharing those talents onward.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's going to make me emotional. But that's actually interesting to bring up because the way that we know each other is that you were my teacher in high school in 12th grade. And that actually brings me to the first thing that I want to talk to you about, because one thing that bothered me a little bit going to Beis Yaakov's was that I felt like a lot of the, not all, but a lot of the teachers that were a little bit of an out-of-the-box thinker, people who thought a certain kind of way, tended to go teach in the Kiruv schools and not in the Beis Yaakov schools. And that's actually one of the reasons why I told myself that if I were ever to become a teacher, I would work within the Kiruv Krovim circles, because I felt like, I don't know exactly what it is that, you know, there's a different way of learning that sometimes seems to happen in the Kiruv space, in the Kiruv Rechokim space, that doesn't always translate over into the Beis Yaakov, which, we also need to learn and understand and have a depth. And one thing that I really loved about your class, you taught us Tamei Mitzvos. One thing that I really loved was that it didn't seem like you taught us any differently because you were in a Beis Yaakov. You still were teaching us on the level that I felt like you would be teaching if you were doing Kiruv, which is kind of ironic that it should be that way. But that was something that I really appreciated. So I know that you've taught Kiruv, you've taught in the Beis Yaakov system, you've taught teenagers, you've taught adults, or you still do. So how does teaching Kiruv Rechokim compare to teaching people who are FFB or currently from, or what I would still categorize as Kiruv, but Kiruv Krovim?
It's so interesting, Cypora, how you describe your experience of the class, because, and your goals within what you're sharing onward, because it's so resonating with me in terms of my goals and mission as a teacher. I went, Baruch Hashem, through the Beis Yaakov system, and I happen to have loved the education I got. I had some amazing teachers, Mrs. Yocheved Nisan from the Twersky family, Mrs. Kozlowitz from Yurkansky, and then I went to seminary in Israel, to one of the typical seminaries that's not even around anymore. And I remember that the principal of the seminary got up during the orientation and he said, "Girls, now you're coming to seminary. This is going to be like totally different than what you've experienced before in learning." And I was like nervous and excited and thinking, wow, I wonder what it's going to be. And the year of learning was great, but it was pretty similar to, I had gone to a great high school tag, and I learned a lot more Rashis again and Rambans again, and a lot of information, but I didn't feel like it was really a different experience than anything I had before. And then I stayed as a madricha, and then that summer I stayed officially to tutor in Neve. But while I was tutoring, I was kind of sneaking in to many of the Kiruv classes of Rabbi David Gottlieb, who was a professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University before he became a Bostoner Chassid, and who teaches Basic Philosophy 101 in Or Sameach, and Rabbi Cordoza, and Rebbetzin Heller. And I remember thinking, this is a different level or type of learning than anything we've had before. And I think the difference really is that when you're in the more FFB world, there's kind of an assumption that, like, if you grew up then from first or second grade, when you come into the classroom and you learn about Hashem, that means you now have Emunah b'Hashem, you love Hashem, you fear Hashem, you, like, it's all there from the beginning, and therefore those questions aren't always brought up or addressed. It's just kind of assumed. And in Neve, it was like, wow, you're not only allowed to, but because nothing is assumed, because the women were not coming from any background, the assumption was like, you really need to address, how do we know that Torah is divine? And what evidence do we have about that? What is the historical verification of Matan Torah happening, which differentiates Judaism from other religions that have other books, lahavdil, that they consider divine? Why do bad things happen to good people? How can Torah dictate emotions? Are emotions even something in our control that we have? And all these different areas of thought and of hashkafa that weren't always brought up. And if they were brought up, then in the FFB world, sometimes there's a feeling of like, that's apikarsis. And like, how could you even ask that question? And it was so refreshing to be able to like be acknowledged to be a thinking person. And as a thinking person, you're allowed to think. That doesn't mean that if you don't have an answer to every question, you're going to be denying, but to really look at the rational evidence that's there. So therefore, my mission, as I see really yours really is too, is I try to just bring that style learning from the Baal Tshuva world of Neve, where I had the schus and the opportunity to experience it, and bring it into the Beis Yaakov world, where I share it, Baruch Hashem, in a number of different schools. But I think that encouraging questions and the joy of questions, I mean, Rashi, Ramban, they're all based on questions.
Judaism is really all about asking questions. That's what Torah is about. And that's even the Jewish personality is it's like part of our personality is to ask questions. But sometimes within the school setting, there's, like you said, it's almost like it's apikarsis. And it's interesting because when you were talking about that, I actually remember now that I had a teacher that was teaching about, I think she was teaching about Purim, if I remember correctly. And she was saying, Hashem saved the Jews. And I raised my hand. I'm like, well, why are we thanking Hashem for saving the Jews? Because he was the one who put them in that situation in the first place. So the teacher said to me, well, you could ask that about anything, really, whenever anybody thanks Hashem for something that Hashem put them through. So I said, okay, so that's my question. And the classmates, the girls in my class were like, whatever, they were reacting a certain kind of way. But the teacher actually was like, to her credit, that's a good question. It's interesting to me because in my family grew up where, and I said this in the first episode, questions are a sign of intelligence. It was something that I took for granted that went on in every home, and my grandmother, actually, my mother's mother was a teacher for many, many, many years. She's extremely knowledgeable, very smart. And she said that her favorite, like something that would make her so excited was if a student could come up with a question that she didn't think of. That was one of her favorite things. I think she said she would give extra credit. So to me, that's a sign of someone who cares and someone who's learning. And I think that the fact that I asked all of those questions is probably why I'm still learning and I'm still teaching, because I cared and I was curious and I still am. So one thing that I actually heard, I'm curious what you think about this, because I really do try to be dan l'kaf schos, not just people, but the community as a whole. But one thing that explained it to me the best, and I would be curious what you think of this, is that the system, the Beis Yaakov system, was set up by Holocaust survivors. And so very likely when the schools began, like the questions were just too big. And that's where that maybe fear of questions came from. And that's why it's like now that we were, second generation still teaching, but third generation, even fourth generation are coming up to start teaching. I think that it's gotten more and more accepted where we can work with these questions. We can encourage questions. We don't have to be so scared.
I wholeheartely agree. I think that is very, very true. And I think at that time and space, people didn't even have the time and energy to even work through learning the answers to those questions. And it was so important to hold on to emunah beyond human understanding, to be able to accept and move ahead as a Torah person, that was the ikar emphasis probably at that time. And we are really blessed from Hashem to live in a generation where people do have the economic and emotional space to really think through, address, discuss questions. And I should just mention as part of this that Rebbetzin Leah Cohen from the Jewish Renaissance Center, which was built as a kiruv place, has now taken her curriculum and made it. He started the Kivun program, which is taught in Masores and in many other high schools right now, which is a hashkafa discussion and question and answer program from 9th through 12th grade, which goes through questions like existence of God, divinity of Torah, Tzadik V'Ralo Rasha V'Tovlo, like Selam Elokim, what is Bechira, real basic questions. And she grew up in Mea She'arim. So, that it shows again, people could have not necessarily come from that background, but if you're a thinker and you're open to it, you can move it and share it. And I'm so glad it is being shared now in the frum world.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. There's definitely a stereotype of people, like the more frum you are, the less of a thinker you are, which in my experience is completely untrue. And dare I say, I had such a culture shock when I went to graduate school, because to me, it was, of course, we're in school and this is an intellectual space and everything should be open for discussion. And in fact, it wasn't quite the case. I had to be careful what I said and make sure that, if you say things that aren't politically correct, you get yourself in trouble. And I was like really shocked by it. I'm like, what do you mean? But we can discuss it, right? Like I took that for granted. So I always think it's strange when I see that stereotype. It's definitely not true at all.
Well, so another difference that I also see between the kiruv world and the frum world, from birth world, is that in the kiruv world, because people have already lived through an alternative lifestyle, there's less that needs to be proven or explained about what the limitations or deficiencies are within that lifestyle, because they've tried it and they're beyond it. As opposed to people who are, especially teenagers, who are in the from birth world, still may have that kind of enamored feeling of like, there may be other things out there that sound so exciting that we have to really give up on in order to be able to choose or live our lifestyle. So I just know, for example, when I was teaching in Neve, my first year, I remember I was supposed to be teaching a class for women on tznius. And I remember thinking, how in the world am I going to present all these restrictions and limitations of like covering knees and covering elbows? I remember thinking, they're just going to think we are these extreme fanatic people. But it was so interesting to me, because once we had learned how tznius is a relearning of how we relate to our bodies and our souls, and how we want other people to really view us in terms of what aspect of ourself is really most dominant and what they're seeing most in their face. All of them, and this was women who were in their 20s, who had been through male-female relationships where tznius or negia were not part of the picture, and they were like, wow, this is so beautiful and so protective, and make sure that a relationship starts from such a deep place. Whereas sometimes for teenage girls, the feeling is kind of like, oh, but if we could only dress in that more open, liberal lifestyle, things could be so much more fun or so much more connected. Although I have to say also that even teaching in the Beis Yaakov world, I really love showing or explaining how tznius is really a developing of a woman's inner self-esteem and being seen in that way. And so many times at the end of a unit on tznius, I'll have girls who'll raise their hand and they'll say, wow, like if I only realized like tznius is a way for a woman to develop internality and inner self-value.
I'm so glad that you brought up tznius because that's one of my like favorite topics to talk about, because it's something that once you understand it, you really can't unsee it. And I will definitely be doing a podcast episode on tznius. And really just the idea that I always talk about, like, the biggest lie that the feminist movement was able to peddle out was that if you want to be respected, you should present yourself with a lack of self-respect. Like, it's just such a lie. It was peddled out, and because it was peddled out, I don't know if it was originally by men or women or a combination of the two, but people just bought right into that and they said this is empowerment. And the truth is that it's very counterintuitive. It's, you dress the way that you want to be treated. If you want people to respect you, you have to present yourself in a way that demands the respect that you deserve. And I actually think that tznius is feminism in the true sense of what it should mean, which is like female empowerment and protecting the respect that women deserve. And so I really, I think that it's one of the most misunderstood topics. But what's really interesting is that when I started to, I put together this tznius lesson on just all of the ideas that I'd compiled and some of my own ideas about tznius. When I first started giving that speech, I would get feedback like, we never heard this before. It was mostly to teenagers. I've never understood it that way, etc. And over the years, the reaction is, less surprise and more, yeah, we've heard that. And obviously there's like a part of me that's like, all right, I liked like being the one that was, blowing people's minds. But I actually, a much bigger part of me is really, I'm really happy to hear that, girls and women are getting a better understanding, and in my opinion, stopping to buy into that lie. And what I'm saying is not as mind-blowing, and it's things that people know. I'll still do an episode on tznius because I still think I have what to contribute to the conversation. But overall, it's not being presented, I don't think, anymore, or it's not being understood anymore the way that it used to be, which is it's a really great thing.
Agreed, agreed, agreed. And I think one of the beauties of having contact with people who have been in the secular world, and this is one of the gifts that I think the Baal Tshuva world has brought into the from birth world. I mean, I know at Neve, when you speak to other women in their 20s who have been through male-female relationships where tznius is not part of it, and sometimes, the disillusionment or the burnt feeling of like, I thought he loved me and I thought that our relationship was deep and real. And then I just found out that so much of it had to do with physical chemistry that I and him may not have even been aware of that was coming to play. I almost feel like those are the people that our teenagers should be exposed to and should speak to and hear from, so that they don't just hear it as a philosophical class.
Right, and even just, was it that that person even ever got to know you, or were they confused because it all becomes one big mush, as opposed to you present yourself in a way where you protect yourself so that if the person likes you, it's really just for you as a person. I think that's a really important piece as well.
So much. So agreed. Absolutely.
So you've taught teenagers and you've taught adults. How does teaching teenagers compare to teaching adults? And I've been in your classes as a teenager and as an adult, because I came to your year, which I was, I think, younger than the average age there by like 20 years. But everyone was really nice and didn't make me feel like I was just the baby in the room. But I was. I, as a student, can't say that I felt a very big difference. And that goes back to what I said about when I experienced, being a student in your class in high school. That was another thing. We were in 12th grade, and I really felt like you were teaching us as adults in the topics that we discussed, and more importantly, the level of, the intellectual level that you were teaching at. I really felt like you were respecting us as young adults, if you will. And it's actually another thing that I try to do as a teacher is I try to see the adult in my students. Even when I was teaching 7th and 8th grade, every child has a little adult inside them. Every adult also has a little child inside them, of course,
Mhm.
but I always try to speak to the adult in the students and hopefully give them the respect. So on your end, that's on my end, but on your end, how do you feel teaching adults versus teaching teenagers?
So I guess I just want to share with the listeners also that one of the things this Monday morning adult class loved Cypora to
Oh,
pieces because she was always like stimulating everybody to think and bringing up interesting questions. And you were so not like shy or embarrassed about many girls in their 20s just wouldn't even come to a class of older women because they'd feel, how am I going to be looked at, or I don't belong
1 second.
socially.
I could feel just them all reacting to you saying older women. So I'm just going to step in and say middle age, very young at heart, very young looking, beautiful women. So
Right,
I can feel
totally.
their wrath.
Totally,
Yeah.
you're right. You are absolutely right. But they always felt, again, you were there because you just loved pursuing MS, and that really crosses all boundaries of age altogether. And that was a very shared endeavor, I think, on all our part. But one of the things that I kept thinking also about is that so many women in my class come to me and say, I wish I would have enjoyed and appreciated learning back when I was in my teens in high school. Like, these classes are so exciting to me and they speak to me so much. And I kept thinking, like, so what are we doing wrong? Because I'm teaching the same material in that high school class as I'm teaching over there. And I don't know what the solution to this is. And maybe because you're closer to their stage in life, maybe you can come up with greater creative ideas. But really, the essence of each of us is our bechira and our ratzon. And when something is self-chosen from our own will and our own choice, it energizes us and it makes it, we own it. And somehow, because I guess our school system has to be built as a school, and therefore there are tests and requirements and homework, I get so simply just sad when girls will turn to me at the end of a class or in the middle of a class and say, do I have to have this in the notes? Is this going to be on the final? And I'm like talking about a whole concept, and you just want to know if you need to know this on a test. Like, and I realize it's not because they're teenagers. It's just because the educational system, and we live in a world where you have to have schools. So therefore, see, in Neve was a place where everybody who was coming because they were curious and wanted to learn. And sometimes we turn off that curiosity because it becomes required learning.
Right. My
So
mother always tells her students there are worse things than learning. That's her line. Yeah, well, that's why it says Katino kabarech mi beis sefer. That's Rashi says that. I always used to think about that because I would teach the last period when I was teaching elementary school, and I would
wow.
just think about that line because they told us, the teachers, we weren't allowed to let the girls leave before the bell. So I would literally stand there. I felt like a prison guard, and as soon as the bell rang, I would like duck out because they'd be like flying
Oh
right
no.
out the door. Yeah. So I always keep that in mind, and I'm sure you do too, when the students ask, is this on the test and things like that. It's not something that I really take personally most of the time because I understand that these are kids that are being forced to learn. They're not there voluntarily. And I actually thought that that was maybe what you were going to say, was talking to an audience that wants to listen to you versus an audience that is forced to, whether they like it or not. But I also personally, if I'm going to be honest, I don't think that it's such a bad thing for people to have to learn. I don't think that it's a terrible thing that students are forced to learn certain topics. I just believe very strongly in education and secular education too. I mean, I was just watching this video. I don't know how much of it is real, because some of the stuff is very edited, and I'm sure that it was, and I hope that it was. But it was just like they have these man on the street videos where they go up to random people and they ask questions. And they were asking some questions about just very, very, very basic questions about history, government, things like that. And it was like terrifying. It was really terrifying. The things that people couldn't answer. Just very basic questions about, who was the first president, things like that. And I, as a person who comes from Holocaust survivors, they didn't go through the Holocaust, they escaped, but, Holocaust survivors, I'm just so aware that ignorance is such a dangerous thing. And so I think it is important that, we force our youth to be educated, at least at a very basic level. And when it comes to Torah, I hear a lot of things more online than I do in person, but that are very ignorant about Torah, about hashkafa, about halacha, and people really coming to very strange conclusions, very disturbing conclusions about Judaism, about Torah, about life, coming from, I think, a really fundamental lack of understanding of Torah.
Wow. I remember one of my teachers once gave a mashal and said, like, a person could stay at the level of second grade math, and you could be fine with that. But when you're going to be 15, do you want to be at this level of second grade math, or do you want to have a more sophisticated development? So if that's true in mathematics and that's true in literature, why should it be any difference in the most essential aspect of who we are, which is, if we're keeping mitzvos, to keep a Shavua, so to keep a Rosh Hashanah the same way I did when I was 15, means that I am limiting my own experience and involvement in that event to a 15-year-old level. It's so expansive to have a podcast, a share, which gives me new deep depth of insight into what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I mean, Torah is one of the most intellectually deep pieces of work, for lack of a better term. So I don't think that a third grade level of understanding is so scratching the surface. It really requires a lot of learning to really get to an adult level of understanding. You can always understand more and more, but I think that of all topics, well, the truth is I'm not a math person per se, so maybe there's like some mathematicians that would disagree, but I would be willing to bet that Torah requires the most revisiting and the most delving into, and has the most to offer intellectually.
I think what you're saying makes so much sense, just because Torah is the only work we have in this world that is divinely written. If Hashem, by definition, is infinite, that means that every word, if Kiviyachal, Torah is his mind, then every word of Torah has infinite planes and levels of depth. So to limit myself to my second grade or even 10th grade or even 12th grade level, it's like you can dive and dive and dive deeper and deeper. It's just sad to lose it. So such a bracha to have access to learning like this.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, because for the same reasons and things that I've already talked about a little bit on the podcast, I have a lot of respect for the people that are listening to the podcast right now, because they're taking that responsibility to make sure that they are learning, even when they're not being forced to learn.
I am with you on that 100%. I agree.
Okay, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but it is almost Elul. By the time the episode is out, it will probably be Elul already. So this is a Torah podcast. What can you share with us about Elul to help myself and the listeners get into the right mindset?
It's interesting because I think different people have different feelings about Elul. You have the Navardic approach of Musar.
I'm Navardic. Do you know that?
Oh, that's right. Your grandmother.
I come from, I'm direct descendant of the Altar of Navardic. Yeah.
I shouldn't be saying a word over here. You should be doing this whole, it's incredible. Wow. So, you have the Musar approach of the fish in the ocean are quaking when Elul comes, because it's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Hadin, and depending who you are and where you're coming from, sometimes a person needs to know this is real, this is serious. Stop being just chilled through life and like, let's take it seriously. On the other hand, Elul personally is like one of my favorite months of the whole year.
Wow.
Yeah, but I think it's because I personally am just like an intense person. So I appreciate intense possibility. Um, the word Elul, literally, we know the names come from Bavel, and the name Elul in Aramaic means to spy or to investigate or to research. In Parshat Shlach, when Moshe Rabbeinu was sending the Meraglim, Latur et haaretz, to spy the land, isn't that interesting that a tour in English, Latur et
Oh,
haaretz, right?
I totally missed that.
So Onkelos translates the word V'yaturu et haaretz as V'ya'alelun Yat'ara. V'ya'alelun means to like spy out, to research, to investigate. So the name Elul by definition is just like a time of introspection, deeper thinking, investigation. And as your whole theme of this podcast is about, like if you're the kind of person who enjoys deeper thought and delving
Yeah.
into like who we are, what we're
I
living.
was thinking those are all my buzzwords, all the words that you said.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's so right. I can see it. Like what we're living for, what's my purpose? How do I actualize it more? So then Elul really speaks to you because Elul is just that month of greater possibility and potential for that kind of deep thinking. I think Rabbi Nivens describes it like Jewish deep thinking month, something
Mm.
like that. And obviously for each person that's going to have very specific individual implications. But on a general level, I know that for many years, I thought of Elul and Rosh Hashanah as kind of a time of thinking about like all the things I've done wrong and all the things I'm going to be in trouble about. And like, oh no, I don't want to get punished. I don't want to get punished. And please, Hashem, help me. And then I went to a class by one of my Rabbeim, Rabbi Orlowick, who spoke about if Rosh Hashanah is really a time of Malchut Hashem. Imagine you come before a king and you say, King, here I am, your subject, ready to serve you. And he says, oh, wow, great. Who are you? What can you do? And you say, I'm terrible. I'm nobody. I'm weak in this and I'm like a failure in this and I did this wrong. That's not the kind of service you want to offer the king. Like, here I am, king. I'd like you to leave me in your world and in your kingdom because I want to really contribute to your kingdom and what your purpose in this kingdom is all about. And therefore, I
Wow.
come before you with a joy. It's an awesome joy. It's a reverent joy. It's a joy of like, wow, this is a responsibility, but it's a joy of like, here I am. Here's what I think I can do. If you leave me in this world another year, I would love to contribute intellectually in this way, emotionally in this way, financially in this way. Here are the resources. Now that takes Ya'alun, that takes investigation and research into myself to self-explore and think about what specific gifts did Hashem give me? Not what am I bad at, but what are my skill set and tool set, and how can I maximize using those? Meaning, if I am an intellectual, which kind of classes can I involve myself in that will help me understand truth on a deeper level? Or what can I give with my intellectualism? And can I be doing partners in Torah for this coming year? So then I'm coming to Hashem and I'm saying, please keep me in your world. I want to contribute with my intellectual skills in this way. If I'm a good baker, if I'm creative, if I'm musical. So then what am I going to do with those talents that are going to expand truth and recognition of you in the world?
And I think midos as well, like if somebody has a lot of patience or if somebody is very empathetic, all of those kinds of things would fit into this category also, I think.
Very, very true, right? Those good listeners, those people who are relationship people, and how am I going to be able to just be a support? And it doesn't have to necessarily, as you're saying, like be public experiences. You don't have to become the head of a Kiruv organization. You
Right.
could be the kind of person who's just going to really be a good listener for your friend, your neighbor, your student, and just try to maximize every experience you're in to be a giver and to be right. One last thing also, Rav Moshe Weinberger taught that I loved also. He said the first Avera that ever happened in the world was Chet Adam Harishon. And the Sefer HaYetzirah, which is a Kabbalistic work written by Avram, passed down from Avram Avinu's time, says that when Adam Harishon did that first Chet, and this will kind of explain every Avera that we do on some level, it says that he removed the letter Daled from two of the names of Hashem. And you're like, what is that about? Daled from names of Hashem? So he said, which two names of Hashem have the letter Daled in them? The Adon, Aleph Daled Nun Yud, Adon with an I, or the Shakai Shin Daled Yud. And he said, if you take out the Daled from each of those names, Aleph Daled Nun Yud without the Daled is Aleph Nun Yud, which is Ani. And the Shin Daled Yud, if you take out the Daled, you're left with a Shin and a Yud, which in reverse order is Yesh, which is like, I'm there, I exist, my will. And he said what the Sefer HaYetzirah really is saying is that on some level, when we lose track of the fact that we're here as creations, and therefore we're here to serve a higher purpose. And it's not only about like, ani, like, what do I want? What do I think? What do I want out of you, God, this year? Like Hashem, what can I manipulate you to give me? It's not about me. It's about not that I'm unimportant. I am very important, but I'm important because I'm here for that higher purpose that I was created for. And therefore, it's not so much about like my Averos and what's going to happen to me. It's kind of like the bigger macrocosmic picture of what am I contributing to Project World. And it doesn't have to be necessarily on a public level, but minute by minute, I think Malchus Hashem B'Rosh Hashanah is just saying, Hashem, whatever life experiences you're going to give me in my life this year, help me have the emotional strength, the wisdom, the insight to be able to use them in ways that aren't just about me, but really maximize what I'm here for.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on Rosh Hashanah, we're actually not allowed to daven for our own selves, only for the general klal, and only to be Mamlech Hashem. That's something that's really discussed a lot as a topic about Rosh Hashanah. So that fits right in so beautifully. That it's really about, it's not about you. That's the point.
Beautiful.
And it's interesting because I know that there's a lot of discussion about what the avodah zarah of our generation is, and there's different answers. But I once heard this, and it was actually a Christian that I heard this from, but he basically said that everyone is so busy serving the God of self. Wow. And I thought, wow, well, isn't that interesting, right? Like, I just thought that seems really true, that there seems to be an idolization of the self. And I really love what you said, that that's the root of really all Averos, is when you become self-serving, when you start to worship the God of self. And it just gets me thinking about, really, Rosh Hashanah is all about being Mamlech Hashem. So it's about reassessing, you're not a God, Hashem is the God, right? And putting yourself back into the correct perspective.
That's it. That is it.
All right. So thank you so much for coming on. This was such a joy. It was so much fun. I think that people are really going to learn a lot, and I hope that it will inspire the listeners. Definitely inspired me perfectly in time for Chodesh Elul. So thank you so much.
And Cypora, I have to just add that aside from everybody else who's listening and joining in together on our conversation, it was great just getting to spend time with you also. And we don't get to talk too much in person. So this was great.
Yeah. I was thinking, I was maybe going to say this in the intro, so I'll say it as we leave off, that we know that it says, Aseh lecha rav, kinei lecha chaver, but every once in a while, you're lucky enough to come across somebody who can personify both of those roles for you. So thank you for being my Rav and my Chaver.
I'm honored to say the same. Cypora, I'm really just so excited that you're doing this, because I feel like it's such a benefit to everybody out there. And you yourself just have so much to share and to give. And to me, it's really, you're a role model of somebody who takes the tremendous talents that Hashem gave you and really makes sure that you're using it out there to change and affect and impact and share with everyone.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate it. And I guess you know more than anyone that this is something that I really felt like I should do, is this a Torah podcast, to just try to teach not just teenagers, even though that's something that I have obviously tremendous respect for. I come from a very big chinuch family, but also adults. I think that that's extremely important.
I fully agree. And I think you happen to be just a great role model in this case for Elul, of like everybody thinking about what skill sets they have and really what they can, not to diminish one's own possibilities, to really think out of that box and say, like, what can I give and do? It's amazing what you're doing. So
yeah, I was actually thinking about that when you were talking about that during that part of the conversation. I was thinking, oh, I started a Torah podcast this year. You know, that was
yep.
one point, I guess. All right.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I will not take up any more of your time. I know you're busy.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Torah with Cypora podcast. And I give you the honor of signing us off.
Always be kind, stand up for truth, and think for yourself.
You got it. Bye, everybody.